The rain was a living, breathing entity, a roaring leviathan from the abyss that had engulfed the world, transforming the meticulously curated landscape of the estate into a swirling, monochromatic fresco of grays and silvers, where the outlines of topiaries were blurred into spectral shapes and the fountains were mere suggestions of form beneath the relentless deluge. It fell not in drops but in solid sheets, a continuous, thunderous avalanche of water that hammered the limestone porch with the force of a million tiny fists, each impact a cold, stinging testament to my exile. The wind was its sinister consort, a howling dervish that ripped through the ancient oaks lining the drive, tearing leaves and small branches free and sending them spiraling into the chaotic darkness, while it knifed through the thin silk of my dress as if the fabric were mere gossamer. The cold was an invasive, malevolent force, a creeping, crystalline death that seeped through every pore, past the surface chill, through layers of flesh and sinew, to coil around my bones and constrict with a promise of permanent stillness. I stood, a monument to abject ruin and shattered faith, on the flooded expanse of the porch that I had once swept with hopefulness, now locked outside the blazing cathedral of warmth and light that was my own home. This night, the apex of my foolish devotion, was to have been my husband Kyrie's birthday gala, an event I had orchestrated with the desperate, meticulous care of a general planning a siege upon his affections, and my reward, my only tribute, was to be cast into the elemental fury like a piece of refuse. My crime was one of archaic dignity. I had drawn a line, not in sand, but in the imported Italian marble of the foyer, and upon it, I had placed my final, crumbling standard, the removal of the woman named Ven, who had glided into my domain on a wave of my mother-in-law's approval, introduced not with subtlety but with a flourish as the muse who finally unlocked Kyrie's true potential. For defending the eroding shores of my marriage in the very heart of my supposed kingdom, I had been apprehended, manhandled, and deposited into the maw of the tempest. Inside, beyond the wide, mullioned window that was now a liquid canvas distorting a masterpiece of betrayal, existed a universe of such violent, radiant contrast it felt like a brilliantly lit diorama in a museum of cruelty. The massive, 12-tiered baccarat crystal chandelier, whose every prism I had cleaned with a vinegar solution and a soft cloth, fearing the maids would be too rough, now blazed like a fallen star, casting a diamond dust light over a scene of lush, joyful treachery. The figures within moved in an elegant, blurred ballet of color and shadow, but my gaze, magnetized by pain, found its fixed points, the familiar, powerful silhouette of Kyrie, my husband of 12 long years, his form etched into my soul. His head was thrown back in laughter, a sound I could feel in my own chest, a booming, confident eruption that had once been the soundtrack to my happiest days. Now, it was a foreign artillery shell exploding in the landscape of my heart. His arm, in the tailored sleeve of the suit I had pressed that very morning, was curled around the cinched waist of Ven, whose gown was not merely sequined but seemed woven from captured moonlight and ambition, each tiny disc a malicious eye winking in the festive glow. Beside them, Mama Odora, the woman I had nursed through a debilitating bout of pneumonia, for whom I had prepared endless trays of broth and dry toast, was transformed into a vision of beatific, maternal pride. Her face, so often a roadmap of disappointment directed at me, was softened, alight with a saccharine adoration as she gazed at the pair, her hands clasped under her chin as if witnessing a miracle. They were gathered in a sacred circle around the piece de resistance of my unraveling, a 5-tiered architectural wonder of vanilla bean genoise and fresh raspberry coulis, a dessert I had designed, sampled, and approved after tasting 6 different buttercream formulas. As Kyrie's large, familiar hand, the hand that had once held mine so tightly in a crowded emergency room, closed over Ven's slender, meticulously manicured one to guide the silver-plated cake server, the scene transcended mere birthday ritual. It became a sacrament. A coronation. A silent, public wedding. The assembled guests, a curated collection of Kyrie's business rivals turned uneasy allies, their surgically enhanced wives, social parasites, and outright sycophants, raised their flutes of $100 champagne in a synchronized toast. Not one face in that glittering constellation turned toward the windowpane, not a single gaze flickered with curiosity or concern for the vanished architect of their evening. In the ruthless economy of that room, I had been declared bankrupt, my shares voided, my presence liquidated from the ledger. Time ceased its forward march. It pooled around me, a stagnant, freezing mode of eternity. Had an hour passed? It felt like a lifetime measured in the slowing drumbeat of my own heart. My body embarked on a grim, physiological pilgrimage through suffering stations. First, violent, convulsive shivering that rattled my teeth and made my joints ache. Then, a deeper, seismic tremor that seemed to originate in the bedrock of my soul, shaking me to my core. Finally, a terrifying, seductive stillness. The cold was no longer an external condition. It was internal weather. It was in my lungs, each ragged, whistling breath a gasp of Arctic air. It was in the sluggish, syrup-thick pulse I could feel in my own throat. My thoughts, once sharp and bright with the shrapnel of fury and despair, grew fuzzy, their edges softening like parchment in the rain. A profound, peaceful resignation, the kind that visits those who have fought to the end of their strength, began to bleed into the cracks of my consciousness. Perhaps this was the fitting, unremarkable end to the saga of Kezia, not a dramatic death with witnesses and last words, but a quiet, anonymous dissolution on the porch of a palace whose cornerstone was her own naivete. I let my eyes close, the afterimage of their celebration, a perfect, hateful tableau, burning against the insides of my eyelids like a brand. From the depths of my spiraling core, I sent out a final, wordless, telegraphic plea into the void, not for rescue, for that ship had sailed into a horizon of betrayal, but for witness. For an impartial, cosmic justice to note the meticulous, exquisite unfairness of it all, to inscribe this moment in a ledger where balance was eventually, inevitably, restored. Then, the light. It pierced my closed eyelids not with the erratic, apocalyptic flash of lightning, but with a steady, oppressive, imperial gold that grew in intensity until it dominated my perception, a sun rising at midnight. I fought against the leaden weight of my eyelids, forcing them apart against the glue of despair. A vehicle, a Rolls-Royce Cullinan in a shade of black so profound it seemed to be a hole cut in the fabric of the storm, had soundlessly, impossibly materialized at the ornate, wrought iron gates of the estate. It was an anachronism, a phantom from a realm of pure order asserting itself upon the chaos. A chauffeur, his uniform a study in sartorial perfection untouched by the tempest's rage, emerged. He opened an umbrella of such vast proportions it seemed a portable pavilion, a canopy of black oilcloth that defied the diagonal fury of the rain, and moved with the deliberate, ceremonial grace of a palace guard to the rear passenger door. It opened, hydraulics sighing softly. A foot emerged, shod not in delicate evening wear but in a stout, exquisitely crafted Oxford of supple leather, with a low, solid heel, the footwear of a sovereign who expects to walk on unstable ground. It met the streaming, dark asphalt with a finality that echoed through the very foundations of the house. Then, the woman. She unfolded herself from the plush, lambswool-lined interior, a figure unbent by the gale or the weight of 8 decades. She was wrapped in a coat of vicuña wool so fine it appeared to be a shadow-given texture, and in one gloved hand, she held not a walking stick for support, but a cane of polished ebony, its handle a smooth, heavy orb of solid, burnished gold, a scepter. This was not my Grandma Hattie. This was not the affectionate, kerchiefed woman who arrived on the Greyhound bus with baskets of sweet potatoes and jars of stewed tomatoes, her stories rich with the earthy humor of rural life. This was Empress Harriet Victoria Sterling. Her eyes, the color of winter flint, swept the grand, illuminated facade of the mansion not with wonder, but with a cold, clinical assessment, an audit. They lingered on the glowing window, taking in the silent, shadow puppet play of revelry within with the detached interest of an entomologist observing a colony. Then, they found me. A discarded heap of sodden silk and shattered spirit on the cold, unforgiving stone. Her regal composure, that magnificent mask of imperturbable authority, fractured for one breathtaking, terrifying instant. In its place flashed a look of such primal, ferocious love and apocalyptic rage that it cut through the hypothermic fog shrouding my mind like a laser. She moved, her assistant, a severe young woman with a tablet, scrambling to keep the vast umbrella aligned, utterly indifferent to the muddy water splashing the pristine hem of her coat. She knelt before me in the flood, the priceless fabric be damned, and her hands, warm, dry, and strong, hands that had built empires, cradled my freezing, rain-lashed face. Kezia. My precious, precious child, her voice was a hoarse whisper, thick with a visceral, trembling emotion I had never heard from her. What in God's name have they done to you? Her touch was a lifeline thrown across an infinite chasm, a connection to a reality I had forgotten. Then, Her gaze lifted again, slowly, deliberately, back to that glowing window, to the luminous celebration of my erasure. The devastating tenderness in her touch vanished, replaced by a quality of hardened, tempered steel. She looked from my broken, near-lifeless form to the house that contained my betrayers, and her next words were not spoken to me, nor to her staff. They were a verdict pronounced upon the universe itself, a sentence passed from a throne of righteous fury, and an execution order signed with a single, breathed phrase. She said only 3 words, but they were delivered with the quiet, continent-splitting finality of tectonic plates grinding against one another, tear it apart. The memory of the party's inception, just hours before, now felt like an archived film reel from someone else's life, a documentary of my own profound, willing blindness. The house that day had not buzzed with festive anticipation, but with the high-strung, silent scream of my anxious, futile labor. I had been a ghost in its echoing, polished halls since 4 a.m., a sleepless phantom measuring linen napkins with a ruler, counting crystal stemware until the numbers blurred, arguing with the florist over the cellular structure of the white gardenias. They must be chastity, not frostproof. The veins are different, and negotiating with the caterer over the ethical sourcing of the Ossetra caviar. I had personally wiped the microscopic fingerprints from every piece of the Christoffel sterling silver cutlery, my own frantic, distorted reflections staring back at me from each hollowed spoon. This night was to be Kyrie's apotheosis, his transformation from successful businessman to untouchable legend, a Midas whose touch turned everything to gold and admiration. I, his wife, was determined to be the invisible, flawless architect of his triumph, a silent partner basking only in the reflected glow he alone would radiate. I harbored a foolish, secret, desperate hope that in the luminous zenith of his achievement, he might finally see me, might turn from the adoring crowd, find my eyes in the multitude, and whisper, "We did it, my love," and in that "we," I would find the validation, the redemption, for 1,000 silent sacrifices. The guests arrived not as individuals, but as a rolling wave of opulent, perfumed self-congratulation. The air grew thick, not with joy, but with the dense, clattering static of transactional conversation, deals hinted at in low tones behind cupped hands, alliances reinforced with the ritual clink of crystal, hollow, formulaic compliments traded like currency on a fast-moving floor. I became a smiling, nodding automaton, a hostess cyborg circulating with a tray I didn't need to carry, my feet screaming in agony within shoes chosen for endurance over elegance, a martyrdom of pinched nerves and blisters. Kyrie was a sun king in his element, a gravitational force around which all lesser planets helplessly orbited. His laughter was a performance, a command that signaled success and demanded fealty. When I gently, tentatively touched his elbow, a ghost of a wifely gesture, and offered a fresh glass of chilled, still water with a slice of cucumber, a silent, caring reminder to pace himself amidst the river of champagne, his eyes, those familiar brown eyes, slid over me, through me, as if I were a pane of smudged glass. The message was transmitted and received with devastating clarity. I was part of the service infrastructure, the plumbing and electricity of his success, not a character in the narrative. The wives of his partners, women sculpted by the finest surgeons and swathed in logoless, whispering cashmere, offered me tight, pitying smiles that performed a swift, comprehensive inventory of my simple, 3 seasons outdated dress, my lack of statement jewelry, my sensible, unadorned heels. I absorbed every slight, every dismissive glance, every patronizing head tilt, like a sponge designed for humiliation, whispering my desperate, weakening mantra into the hollow of my own soul, this is for him. For us. For the life we built together from nothing, The atmosphere didn't merely change when Ven arrived, it underwent a seismic, irrevocable shift, as if the room itself had taken a deep, anticipatory breath and exhaled a new, predatory energy. She didn't merely enter through the grand, double-height doors, she manifested within the space, as if the party had been a void waiting for its true center of mass. The doors seemed to part not for her, but because of her. Her gown was a deliberate, glorious provocation, a cascading river of thousands of hand-sewn, paved gold sequins that moved with a sound like a cascade of ancient coins, clinging to a form that spoke of private Pilates sessions, personalized macro diets, and the singular focus of a social climber. Her hair was a masterpiece of balayage and extensions, a waterfall of honeyed wheat and caramel, her smile a calibrated, dazzling instrument of charm, conquest, and cold calculation. The room's collective response was a palpable, physical wave. Conversations stuttered, died mid-syllable. Heads swiveled in unison as if pulled by invisible marionette strings. But the most profound, soul-crushing metamorphosis was in Kyrie. The genial, backslapping, backroom-dealing host evaporated into the ether. In his place stood a boyish, almost awkward man, his entire being, his posture, his focus, the very light in his eyes, magnetized and pulled toward her singular presence. He physically broke from a circle of dour-faced, spreadsheet-minded venture capitalists mid-sentence, his departure so abrupt it bordered on insulting, his destination singular, absolute, and undeniable. Then. "You actually made it," he boomed, a genuine, unguarded, boyish joy flooding his voice, a relic from a time before quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. It was a tone of pure delight he hadn't used with me in years, not since we'd slept on a mattress on the floor of our first apartment, dreaming aloud. She flowed into his side, not like a guest arriving, but like a missing piece of a puzzle clicking definitively into place, a public claim staked with the effortless, terrifying grace of a natural predator. And then, the coup de grace, the twist of the knife, Mama Odora. She appeared as if conjured by the very force of the betrayal, her face, so often a landscape of pinched disapproval and unmeetable standards meticulously applied to me, now transformed into a picture of radiant, grandmotherly adoration and pride. She embraced Ven, air-kissing both cheeks with loud, theatrical moi sounds. "Darling girl. You look absolutely transcendent. A vision. A breath of fresh air in this stuffy old room. Come, you must meet everyone who truly matters," she trilled, her voice carrying like a bell, looping her arm possessively through Ven's and leading her on a triumphal, processing victory lap through the stunned and admiring crowd. I stood frozen, a forgotten statue holding a tray of empty, lipstick-stained champagne flutes in my numb hands, forced to bear witness as my mother-in-law extolled Ven's fictitious, brilliant, strategic legal mind. She was, in reality, a moderately competent paralegal. Her old money, East Coast pedigree, her parents owned a moderately successful chain of dry cleaners in New Jersey, her impeccable, innate, effortless taste. Each adjective was a scalpel, expertly and publicly dissecting my own contributions, my own humble background, my carefully cultivated, practical style, my very identity. This was the woman for whom I had prepared bland, comforting meals for 3 weeks following her complicated gallbladder surgery, whose endless, trivial, midnight phone calls about imaginary ailments I had patiently fielded, who had called me daughter in rare, wine-softened moments of sentimentality. In this glittering, judgmental coliseum, I was not just invisible, I was an inconvenient ghost, a lingering smell of the past, of struggle and sacrifice, while Ven was the vibrant, perfumed, unburdened future. A cold, clear, and terrifying fury, purer and more powerful than any emotion I'd felt in a decade of slow-dying hope, began to crystallize the diffuse, paralyzing pain inside me. It started as a hard, frozen diamond of rage in the pit of my stomach, a core of absolute zero, then radiated outwards along my limbs, stilling their tremors, steadying my ragged breath, focusing my vision until the periphery blurred and the trio stood in horrifying, hyperreal clarity. The cacophony of the party, the laughter like shattering glass, the music a meaningless throb, the clatter of utensils, faded into a dull, roaring hum, as if I had been plunged deep underwater. I carefully, deliberately, with a calm that felt alien, set the heavy tray down on a passing server's stand, the clink of glass on metal absurdly, profoundly loud in the newfound silence of my own mind. I turned and began to walk toward them. My path cut a silent, burning furrow through the crowd, which parted not out of respect, but out of a voracious, collective, morbid hunger for drama. I stopped before the golden triad, a solitary, stark figure in a modest, now dampening dress standing before a gilded, laughing monument to her own obsolescence. "Kyrie," I said, and my voice did not crack or waver. It was low, steady, metallic, and carried to the farthest, most eavesdropping corners of the suddenly, utterly silent room. "I require an explanation. Now. Why is this woman in our home, holding on to my husband as if he were her personal property, being introduced by your mother as if this were her rightful, inherited domain?" The bubble of false, feverish meritude around us popped with an almost audible, violent snap. 100 pairs of eyes swiveled, gleaming not with warmth, but with the cold, sharp anticipation of scandal and schadenfreude. Kyrie's face underwent a terrifying, rapid-fire transformation, from charming host to confused annoyance, then to searing embarrassment, and finally settling into a rictus of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Kezia," he hissed, stepping slightly in front of Ven in a protective gesture that felt like a physical evisceration, a declaration of alliance that severed my last thread of hope. "Don't you dare start. Not here. Not tonight. Don't you dare embarrass me in front of my guests." Ven peeked from behind the shield of his shoulder, her voice a cloying, poisonous syrup of false concern. "Oh, Kyrie, darling, don't be cross with her. Can't you see she's just feeling a bit displaced? It's only natural, I suppose, given the circumstances." Mama Odora puffed up like an enraged, bejeweled bullfrog, her diamonds and sapphires glittering with indignant fire. "You vile, jealous, petty creature. Your envy is a stench in this room. Ven is a lady of quality and refinement. You are making a vulgar, common spectacle of yourself and of this family. Apologize to her this instant and remove yourself from our sight." Something within me, the very last, fraying, gossamer thread of a lifetime of compliance, of swallowed words, of accepted slights and digested humiliations, snapped with an almost audible, psychic twang. "The only person who will be removing herself," I stated, my arm rising, my index finger pointing not just at Ven's smirking face, but at the corrupt, rotten heart of the constellation they formed, "is her. This is my house. That is my lawful husband. You are a guest who has grotesquely, arrogantly overstayed your welcome. Get out of my home now." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum so complete it seemed to suck the oxygen from the vast room. Then Kyrie moved. His hand shot out with viper speed and clamped around my wrist, not like a man holding his wife, but like a bailiff apprehending a criminal, an iron manacle of flesh and bone, his fingers biting into my tendon and radial pulse with brutal, punishing pressure. He yanked me toward him, off balance, leaning in so close his breath, hot and sour with the tang of expensive Cabernet and betrayal, washed over my face. His words were a venomous, guttural, sibilant whisper meant only for my ears, yet in the dead, breathless quiet of the ballroom, they rang out with terrifying, crystalline clarity. "You ruin everything I touch. You are an anchor, a millstone around my neck, a black cloud over every achievement. If you can't tolerate my happiness, if you can't accept the simple, obvious reality of my life, then you have no place in it. No place here." He then began to drag me, not toward a private study for a hushed, marital argument, but on a long, humiliating, torturous parade through the very heart of his party, through the dense thicket of gaping guests, across the vast, echoing expanse of the Carrara marble foyer, a public, brutal, ceremonial display of my dethronement and erasure. I stumbled, my cheap shoes catching on the edge of the Persian rug, my free arm flailing for a balance that was both physical and existential. I caught fragmented, freeze-frame reactions from the gallery of onlookers, eyes deliberately averted, hands rising to cover amused smirks, the cold, glittering, undeniable satisfaction burning in Mama Odora's triumphant gaze. He wrenched open the heavy, solid oak front door, its weight usually a symbol of security, and the storm's full, roaring fury rushed in as a wet, chaotic, screaming accomplice to the crime. I made one last, desperate, pathetic grab for leverage, the only currency I had left in this ruined economy of love. "If she goes," I gasped, the wind tearing the words from my lips and shredding them into nonsense, "I go." His answer was a brutal, open-palmed shove to the center of my chest, a blow that carried not just physical force, but the full weight of his disgust. It sent me stumbling backward, my feet slipping on the wet, smooth limestone, and I landed hard on my tailbone on the waterlogged porch, a jolt of pain shooting up my spine. "You've made your choice," he snarled, his face a twisted mask of finality, and the door boomed shut in my face with the sound of a vault ceiling. The subsequent, definitive, metallic clunk-clunk of the heavy, brass deadbolt engaging was the most soul-killing, universe-ending sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of my entire history, my love, my faith, my countless silent sacrifices, being entombed in a sarcophagus of his indifference. For a time, I was pure, feral, wounded instinct. I hammered on the solid, unyielding oak with fists that quickly grew raw, abraded, and bloody, my screams ripped from my throat and carried away by the howling wind, lost in the cannonade of thunder. I pleaded to the impassive wood, to the man who lived in the palace behind it, to any silent, indifferent deity that might be eavesdropping on this profoundly private hell. No response came. But after an interminable period, faintly, maddeningly, from the depths of the house, the music started again, a smooth, upbeat, careless jazz standard, a sonic symbol of life and festivity blithely, cruelly moving on without me. Defeated, physically broken, and spiritually annihilated, I stumbled, half crawling, around the side of the house, drawn like a moth to the flame of my own execution, a condemned prisoner compelled to witness the reading of the death warrant. The scene inside the great, arching window was a perfectly composed, brilliantly lit Dutch painting of my replacement. The cake was now sliced, ravaged. Kyrie was lifting a forkful of the vanilla bean and raspberry concoction I had chosen to Ven's laughing, parted mouth, and she, with a coquettish, possessive gesture, reached up to dab a single, mocking speck of white buttercream from the corner of his lip. Mama Odora looked on, beaming with a proprietary, matriarchal pride, the proud queen mother at her son's second, superior wedding. Guests mingled, chatted, drank, their faces relaxed once more, utterly unconcerned with the woman who had vanished from their midst as completely as a dismissed servant. I pressed my forehead to the cold, streaming glass, the physical chill a pale, insignificant echo of the howling, absolute zero void within me. Memories, unbidden and exquisitely, meticulously cruel, flooded the emptiness, each one a shard of glass. The drafty, one-room studio apartment above a noisy laundromat, with the persistent, maddening drip 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 in the far corner that we'd catch in a saucepan, the single, bare, 60-watt bulb hanging from a cord over a rickety, second-hand table where we shared dreams over bowls of instant ramen, our knees touching under the cheap wood. The pawn shop counter, the fluorescent light harsh on the felt pad, my heart breaking silently as I handed over my mother's delicate, heirloom pearl earrings, the last tangible piece of her, for a depressingly small lump of cash that became his, critical, cannot-fail seed money, for a business proposal I never fully understood. The countless evenings I'd claimed, with a convincing smile, that I'd already eaten while preparing his plate, so he could take the last serving of chicken or fish to work the next day in a polished stainless steel lunch pail, maintaining the crucial facade of a prosperous, well-provided-for young executive on the rise. Every skipped meal, every silenced doubt, every defended dream against concerned friends and family, every moment of shared poverty and whispered hope in the dark, they had all been bricks, mortared with my loyalty, my love, my very life force, in the foundation of this very mansion where another woman now reigned as queen, unaware of the blood and tears in the mortar. The betrayal was not merely of love or marital vows, it was a betrayal of shared history, of a sacred partnership I had believed was our covenant, of a narrative I had helped write with my own flesh, only to be ruthlessly, completely edited out of the final, glorious draft. The cold transition from acute misery to a silent, stealthy, mortal threat. My violent, convulsive shivering ceased altogether, a dangerous, clinical sign of advanced hypothermia setting in, the body's final surrender. A deep, seductive lethargy, a siren song promising painless sleep and an end to the agony, pulled insistently at the frayed edges of my consciousness. My legs, numb pillars of ice disconnected from my will, finally buckled completely, and I slumped onto the flooded flagstones, the icy water rising around my hips like a glacial, accepting shroud. I hugged my knees to my chest, the universal fetal position against the vast, uncaring cruelty of the universe, my mind beginning to drift on a dark, warm, welcoming current toward oblivion. In that hypothermic haze, on the porous border between consciousness and nothingness, I sent out a final, wordless, telegraphic dispatch to the uncaring, silent cosmos, let this pain be recorded. Let this injustice be witnessed. Let there be a reckoning, if not for me, then for the principle of it all, for every silent, sacrificed woman whose love became the foundation for another's palace, and then, the light. Not from the house of betrayal, but from the drive, twin orbs of pure, piercing halogen whiteness cutting through the silver-gray, vertical sheets of rain. The almost silent, powerful purr of a perfectly tuned, 12-cylinder engine. The surreal, dreamlike vision of the black Rolls-Royce Cullinan, a leviathan emerging from the abyssal depths, its paint so deep it seemed to absorb the very night around it. The choreographed, precise, ceremonial emergence of my grandmother, a figure stepping not from a car, but from a myth I never knew, was the central chapter of my own inheritance. Her kneeling in the filthy muck, the shocking, life-affirming warmth of her hands, the overwhelming weight and faint, familiar scent of lavender and cedar from her cashmere coat, these sensations were violently, wonderfully real, cutting through the numbness like a scalpel. And when she looked from my broken, near-lifeless form to the brightly lit diorama of celebrants in their golden, gilded cage, her command was not an emotional outburst, not a scream of rage. It was the calm, irrevocable, poised pronouncement of a supreme justice, a sovereign issuing a decree that would reshape reality. Tear it apart. Her words were not a request, they were a key turning in a colossal, ancient lock buried in the foundations of the universe, unleashing forces of retribution and reclamation long held in disciplined check. The bodyguards, 4 of them, materializing from the primary car and a trailing, blacked-out suburban-like shadows given substance, were not mere hired muscle, they were instruments of precision, extensions of her formidable will. The first did not knock or ring. He assessed the grand, oak door for a half-second, a craftsman evaluating his material, took 2 deliberate, measured steps back and delivered a single, devastating, piston-driven kick beside the heavy, polished lock. The sound was not of wood breaking, but of reality itself splintering, of a carefully maintained illusion shattering. The ornate doorframe exploded inward, splinters flying. The solid, 3-inch thick oak door, a symbol of exclusion, flew inward with terrifying, whiplash force to crash against the foyer's interior wall, taking a chunk of plaster and a small landscape painting with it in a cascade of dust and debris. The storm, now an invited guest, followed them in, a chaotic, damp, roaring invasion of the sterile, climate-controlled, perfumed atmosphere. The music died with a pathetic, digital squawk. Laughter turned to sharp, startled, animalistic gasps. Kyrie, a forkful of my vanilla bean cake halfway to Ven's waiting, painted mouth, froze, his expression a comical mask of confusion that rapidly morphed into purple, sputtering, apoplectic outrage. He surged forward, puffing out his chest, the master of the domain confronting the barbarians at his gate. What is the meaning of this? This is a private residence. Get out. I'll have you arrested for breaking and entering. Security. He rushed the nearest bodyguard, a mountain of a man in an impeccably tailored suit that did nothing to conceal his lethal capability, and shoved at his chest with both hands. It was like shoving a redwood tree, a granite cliff face. The bodyguard didn't retaliate with violence, he simply brushed Kyrie's arms aside with a motion of sublime, contemptuous indifference, sending my husband spinning off balance, arms windmilling. Kyrie crashed into the remains of the cake table, sending the ruined, multi-tiered tower sliding to the floor in a sickening, final splat of buttercream, genoise, and fresh raspberries, a metaphor made visceral. My grandmother entered then, with me leaning heavily on her steadfast, silent chauffeur, a phantom returned from the grave, a wronged spirit given formidable substance. Her cane's tap-tap-tap on the wet, debris-strewn marble floor was a deliberate, metronomic death knell for the evening's carefully constructed, glittering illusions. Mama Odora recovered her voice first, dripping with sarcastic, profoundly misplaced recognition. Well. Look what the storm blew in. If it isn't Kazia's simple, country grandma. Come to fetch your drowned rat of a granddaughter? Take her and be gone. You're tracking filth and river water into a clean, respectable house. My grandmother did not even grant her a glance. Her flinty, uncompromising eyes held Kyrie's, who was wiping cake and humiliation from his ruined Brioni shirt, his face a masterpiece of fury, dawning confusion, and the first icy trickle of fear. I am not here to fetch, she stated, her voice echoing in the wrecked, stunned silence of the great room. I am here to repossess. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible, regal tilt of her chin. What followed was not a mindless, chaotic riot, but a methodical, coldly artistic, surgical dismantling. It was violence, yes, but of a calculated, purposeful, almost beautiful kind. One bodyguard walked with calm intent to the integrated, state-of-the-art sound system, found the central hub behind a panel, and ripped the entire bundle of wires from the wall with a single, brutal, satisfying tug, sparks fizzing briefly. Another went to the lavish, 30-foot-long buffet, gripped the edge of the starched, Belgian linen tablecloth, and in one smooth, powerful, practiced motion, whipped it away. A symphony of destruction erupted. Crystal champagne flutes and water goblets exploded like tiny, transparent grenades, porcelain chargers and serving platters shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, silver chafing dishes clanged and spun like discordant, out-of-control tops across the polished floor. Canapés of blini and beluga caviar, slivers of imported San Daniele prosciutto, whole wheels of aged, cave-aged Gruyere, all became instant garbage underfoot, crushed and smeared. Another guard walked with a measured pace down the line of massive, extravagant floral arrangements, toppling each one with a casual, backhanded shove, stomping on the clusters of helium balloons, which popped with a rapid-fire sound like distant, celebratory gunfire. Another focused on the curated art. He took the large, pretentious, commissioned oil portrait of Kyrie and Ven, surprise, gift from Mama Odora, revealed just that night, from its place of honor on the wall, held it aloft for a moment for all to see the smiling, painted faces of the illicit couple, and then, with a twist of his torso, drove his elbow through the very center of the canvas. The painted, smug faces tore apart with a visceral, canvas-ripping crack, the ornate, gilded frames splintering like kindling. My grandmother, from her central position on Kyrie's throne sofa, directed this orchestrated chaos with slight, subtle, devastating gestures of her golden-handled cane. Asterisk that hideous, overpriced abstract sculpture he bought at a charity auction to appear cultured. That vulgar, oversized, gilded urn from a dubious antiquities dealer. The still bubbling, four-tiered champagne fountain, a testament to excess asterisk with each targeted crash. Kyrie flinched as if physically struck, his sense of ownership, of identity, being dismantled piece by symbolic piece. Mama Odora screamed, first in outraged propriety, then in genuine, wailing, maternal distress as decorative items she had contributed, a priceless Sèvres vase from her own mother's collection, a set of Georgian silver candelabras that were her pride, were singled out and destroyed with impersonal efficiency. Ven simply looked terrified, her earlier confidence utterly evaporated, trying to shrink into the damask wallpaper, become part of the pattern, invisible. My grandmother then removed a sleek, black phone from her coat pocket, typed a brief, one-word message, and within seconds, the house's sophisticated, smart lighting system, controlled by an app, began to strobe erratically, a disorienting, nightmarish discotheque effect, before plunging the entire scene into near-total darkness, save for the eerie, green glow of exit signs and the frequent, stark, bone-white flashes of lightning from the ongoing storm outside. This was the final, masterful, psychological touch that dissolved the last vestiges of social order and civilized pretense. The veneer of wealthy, cultured society evaporated instantly. The guests, now merely frightened, panicked animals in outrageously expensive clothing, scrambled for the exits in a blind, screaming herd. They shoved each other, trampled over the glittering debris of their own evening, abandoned fur stoles, designer clutches, and even shoes in their desperate, undignified flight. The sound of car engines roaring to life and tires screeching violently on the wet gravel drive soon replaced the jazz, a symphony of cowardly retreat. Within 10 minutes, the only souls left standing in the apocalyptic, post-war wreckage of the great room were the architects of my pain and the impassive, efficient agents of their meticulously planned downfall. My grandmother, as if she owned the very air and the silence that now filled it, settled onto the largest, most ostentatious sofa, the one Kyrie referred to as his throne, where he held court. She beckoned to the discreet, serious-faced man who had accompanied her, a doctor with a leather medical bag. He attended to me with quiet, professional efficiency, wrapping me in foil-lined thermal blankets that crinkled with warmth, checking my pulse and pupil response with a penlight, handing me a thermos of sweet, scalding hot tea that burned a path of life back down my throat. The simple, profound, human kindness of it, the focused, undivided care on my physical well-being, was a stark, almost shocking contrast to the preceding hours of calculated psychological cruelty and physical neglect. It brought a dangerous, uncontrollable flood of tears to my eyes, which I no longer had the strength to blink back. They streamed down my face, hot and silent, mixing with the cold rain still on my skin. Once the doctor nodded to her, indicating I was stable and out of immediate danger, my grandmother turned her terrifying, laser-like focus back to the stunned, disheveled, ruined trio. Her assistant, a young woman with a severe bun and the bearing of a special forces operative, produced a thick, legal-sized accordion folder, bulging with paper. My grandmother took it and dropped it onto the glass coffee table, now scarred with deep scratches and smeared with chocolate buttercream and pulverized raspberries. Before you waste what little breath and credibility you have left on empty threats of lawsuits you cannot afford and police you do not own, she said, her voice devoid of all emotion, a flat, cold, forensic plain, educate yourselves. Understand the architecture of your own ruin. Kyrie, his hands visibly trembling, his earlier bluster completely deflated, stooped and picked up the heavy folder as if it were a lead weight. The first document, on heavy linen paper, was the property deed. The listed owner was not Kyrie and Kezia, nor any family trust in his name. It read, in stark, official typography, Sterling Legacy Holdings, LLC. The following pages were forensic financial audits of his company, Kyrie Solutions Incorporated, showing a series of strategic venture capital infusions and convertible debt notes from that same LLC, dating back to the company's founding, the very first investment that had launched him. Subsequent documents were notarized bank records and wire transfer confirmations, tracing the flow of those specific, serial-numbered funds directly into the escrow account for this mansion's purchase, the loan documentation for his Ferrari, the signed lease agreements for Ven's luxury apartment in the premier downtown tower. The final, pristine sheet was a corporate charter. The sole shareholder, chairman, and chief executive officer of Sterling Legacy Holdings was listed in bold, Harriet Victoria Sterling. My Grandma Hattie. Kyrie's face was a textbook study in the catastrophic, total collapse of a carefully constructed identity. It cycled through stages of grief for his own ego, confusion, dismissive disbelief, this is a forgery, dawning, stomach-churning, vertiginous horror, and finally, a sickly, corpse-like understanding that bleached all color from his skin. He had not been a self-made titan, a entrepreneurial genius. He had been a carefully funded, closely observed, long-term experiment, a puppet whose strings were held, and could be cut with a single thought, by the unassuming, simple woman he just derided as a country bumpkin. The empire he preened over, the status he leveraged, the confidence that was his currency, it was not his kingdom. It was a gilded cage, a test of character administered by a silent, omniscient proctor. And he had failed, not marginally, but spectacularly, publicly, and definitively. The legal clauses, written in impenetrable legalese by the finest corporate lawyers money could buy, were unequivocal: gross misuse of corporate assets, breach of fiduciary duty, personal enrichment at the expense of the entity, moral turpitude bringing the holding company into disrepute. Every single asset, down to the furniture, the art, the cars, acquired with the flow of sterling capital was subject to immediate seizure and forfeiture. He didn't own a paperclip. I built that corporate structure, my grandmother stated, each word falling with the weight and finality of a tombstone being lowered, as a cradle, a trust, for Kezia's future security and happiness. I remained a silent, anonymous partner, a foolish generosity on my part, a woman's softness, to preserve your fragile male pride, hoping the gift of opportunity, untainted by obligation, would allow you the space to grow into a man truly worthy of her heart. You took my capital and her unwavering, selfless devotion and built a monument to your own avarice, your staggering infidelity, and your profound, incurable smallness of spirit. The experiment, she concluded, the word hanging in the air like a verdict, is concluded. She gave them 10 minutes to vacate the premises, taking nothing that was not physically on their persons at that exact moment. Kyrie's sputtering, fragmented protests, about legality, about his hard work, about his name on the mortgage statements, were met with her impassive, stone-faced silence. Mama Odora's attempt to crawl on her knees across the ruined, food and glass-strewn floor to me, to grasp the edge of my thermal blanket and wail about family, forgiveness, Christian charity, and a mother's love, was met with my averted gaze, my eyes fixed on my grandmother's face, drawing strength from its unyielding resolve. I finally found my voice, soft but clear as a shard of the broken crystal on the floor, resonant in the ravaged room. You defined family for me tonight, Mama Odora. You defined it as the people inside the warm, dry, laughing house, toasting and feasting while your son's lawful wife was outside in the lethal storm. I am simply, finally, accepting your definition. Then, seeing the tide turning irrevocably and sensing the looming poverty, tried to inch toward a side door, clutching a beaded Judith Lieber purse that now bulged suspiciously, lumpy with ill-gotten gains. My grandmother's head of security moved with panther-like, terrifying speed, blocking her path and holding out his hand, palm up. "The purse," he commanded, tone leaving no room for debate. She clutched it to her chest, her bravery a thin veneer. "It's mine. You have no right." He simply took it, his strength making her resistance laughable, a child holding onto a toy, and appended it onto a side table. A cascade of gold rings, diamond bracelets, and a triple-strand pearl necklace, all instantly recognizable to Mama Odora, who screamed, "Thief! You viper!" spilled out, along with a thick wad of cash that Kyrie, with dawning, sick horror, recognized as the emergency $5,000 he kept hidden in his study drawer. The bodyguards, on my grandmother's silent, microscopic cue, then formed an implacable, human cordon and began to herd the three of them, like skittish cattle, toward the shattered, gaping doorway that once symbolized welcome. Their resistance was a pathetic, flailing, theatrical performance, Kyrie's impotent shouts fading into choked sobs, Mama Odora's theatrical wails now genuine cries of loss, Ven's shrill curses dissolving into terrified whimpers, useless against the quiet, immovable, physical force of the guards. They were escorted, then firmly, decisively pushed, across the violated threshold and back into the unrelenting, cleansing, judgmental rain. The grand, broken door was pulled shut behind them by one of the guards. I heard the sound of a heavy, temporary bolt being driven home from the inside, a sound of permanent exclusion. The reversal of fortune was absolute, poetic, symmetrical, and complete. Their unraveling in the days, weeks, and months that followed was a slow, public, and meticulously documented theater of cosmic, almost Shakespearean, karma. That first night, after a screaming, vicious argument on the storm-lashed lawn, Ven managed to flag down a passing taxi, its yellow light a beacon of cowardly escape. Before getting in, she turned to Kyrie, her face twisted with a contempt that was now unmasked. "You're a loser. A fraud. I'm not sinking with this rotten ship." She revealed she'd already taken the cash from his drawer and, in the earlier chaos of the bodyguard's entrance, had deftly lifted his favorite platinum Patek Philippe watch from his wrist. The taxi sped away into the silver curtains of rain, leaving Kyrie and his mother standing alone in the driveway of the home that was no longer theirs, the mansion's lights now extinguished, a dark, hulking silhouette against the stormy sky. They spent the night huddled together on a hard, wet bench in a nearby, deserted public park, their once fine clothes soaked, ruined, and stinking of wet wool and despair, their pride in tatters, their world reduced to the span of a damp, graffiti-covered wooden slat. The following days were a cascading, accelerating series of professional, financial, and social humiliations. Kyrie, attempting to regain some semblance of control, went to his office the next morning, only to be barred at the lobby by security guards who once saluted him obsequiously. His photo was on a laminated, "Do not admit" list taped beside the reception desk. A company-wide email, CC to every employee and major client, detailed his immediate termination for gross misconduct, misappropriation of funds, and actions bringing the company into disrepute. His corporate credit cards were cancelled before he could try to use them. His personal bank accounts, cunningly tied to the company's treasury for operational efficiency, at his own insistence, were frozen by a pre-dawn court order obtained by Sterling Legacy's formidable, pitiless legal team. The fire sale of his beloved Ferrari to a shady, back-alley used car dealer brought in a pittance, just enough to secure a week's rent in a single, dank, airless room in a decaying boarding house in the city's most forgotten, industrial quarter. The room was a shrine to abject despair, walls stained with maps of ancient damp, a single, bare, flickering bulb hanging from a wire, a thin, lumpy mattress on the floor that smelled of mildew, sweat, and defeat. Mama Odora, whose health had always been precarious, declined rapidly in the foul, humid, spore-filled air. Her cough became a constant, wet, rattling presence, a morbid soundtrack to their new poverty, echoing in the narrow, dark hallway. They survived on day-old bread from a discount bakery and cheap, salty broth from a packet, their world shrinking with each passing hour to the four peeling, oppressive walls and the gnawing, constant anxiety of what the next hour, the next day, would bring. My transformation, in stark, breathtaking, radiant contrast, was a glorious sunrise after a lifetime of twilight, an education and a coronation. My grandmother's primary estate, Havenwood, was not just a home, it was a sanctuary, a fortress of books and quiet strength, a library of lived experience, and a finishing school for a life of power and purpose I was destined by blood and trial to lead. She treated me not as a wounded, fragile creature to be coddled, but as an heir who had been kept deliberately, cruelly untutored, and now needed a decade's worth of education compressed into months. Wealth without wisdom is a curse, Kezia, she would intone during our long, intense mornings in her walnut-paneled library, now my classroom and war room. Power without perspective is a poison. You will own this legacy, you will understand its every rivet and ledger entry, you will feel its heartbeat, so that never again, until your last breath, can any man make you feel like a beggar, a ghost, or a servant in your own story. Under her stern, exacting, yet infinitely patient and proud guidance, I learned to dissect complex balance sheets, to negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts while reading the subtle tells in an opponent's eyes, to understand the delicate, global leverage points in real estate development, venture capital, and international trade, the vast, interconnected, powerful web of the empire she had built silently, tenaciously, from a single, struggling grocery store she'd inherited as a young widow decades ago. It was an empire far vaster, more resilient, more nuanced, and infinitely more powerful than the flimsy, debt-ridden, ego-driven facade Kyrie had perched upon like a noisy, preening crow. My external change was a deliberate, powerful, joyful reflection of the internal revolution. I allowed myself, with the help of a discreet, brilliant stylist, to be fitted for clothes that spoke of quiet authority rather than whispered apology, tailored blazers in rich, neutral fabrics, elegant dresses that honored my modesty and style while declaring my new, unassailable status. I learned to carry myself not as an apologetic guest in the world, but as a stakeholder, a woman who belonged in any room she entered, from a factory floor to the most exclusive boardroom. The day I walked into the soaring, light-filled, modernist atrium of the Sterling Legacy Group headquarters, not as a visitor or a curiosity, but as the newly appointed, unanimously approved Vice Chairwoman of Strategic Development, the hushed, respectful silence that followed my path, the subtle nods from grizzled veterans of the business, was more affirming, more filling, than any applause or empty flattery I'd ever received. News of my ascent, of the secret heiress stepping out of the shadows of domestic oblivion and into her formidable, radiant birthright, made not just the business section headlines, but the style pages and society columns. It eventually, inevitably, trickled down through the city's complex gossip streams and sewer-like tabloids, finding its way to the grimy alleys where Kyrie now labored as a day loader at a wholesale produce market, his once smooth hands now calloused and stained, his spirit crushed into dust. Seeing my face on the front of a discarded financial weekly, serene, confident, and powerful in a boardroom setting, my eyes clear and my expression one of calm command, was the final, crushing, definitive blow to the last of his delusions. The woman he had dismissed as a nuisance, as a millstone, as an embarrassing relic, was now a force of nature, a sovereign of an economic realm he could barely comprehend from his position in the gutter. In a last, desperate, pathetic gambit born of utter ruin and a flickering, selfish hope, he used his last few sweaty, crumpled dollars to take a series of grimy buses across town and storm the gleaming Sterling Legacy Tower. He tried to bulldoze his way past the sleek, corporate security, shouting my name, invoking our past, appealing to the good, forgiving, soft-hearted woman he thought still existed, buried beneath the executive armor. His pleas turned to threats, his threats to pathetic, weeping cries. From the sanctity of a private, rising elevator, its brushed steel doors just beginning to close, I saw him for a fleeting, surreal second, a red-faced, disheveled, aging stranger in stained work clothes being firmly, impersonally escorted out by two large guards. Our eyes met across the polished lobby. In his, I saw a bottomless well of regret, not for the pain he'd caused, but for the power, the status, the life he'd so carelessly lost. In mine, he saw only a calm, impenetrable mirror, reflecting back the hollow, broken stranger he had become. I felt nothing. Not a spark of hatred, not a glimmer of triumphant schadenfreude. Just a vast, empty, peaceful distance, as if observing a sad specimen from another, irrelevant species. The elevator doors closed with a soft whoosh, cleanly, surgically severing the last, thin, frayed connection to a past that was already ash. The final, formal, legal severance occurred on the grimy, trash-strewn doorstep of his rented room, under a oppressive, humid sky that promised another storm. I arrived not with a vengeful entourage, but with my grandmother's steely-eyed lawyer and one, discreet bodyguard, a presence of power, not panic. I handed Kyrie the divorce papers, the terms exceptionally, ruthlessly favorable to me, as they were squarely based on his provable infidelity, psychological abuse, and dissipation of marital assets. I offered a plain, unsealed white envelope to Mama Odora, who reached for it with trembling, eager, claw-like hands, her eyes feverish. "This is a one-time act of charity," I said, my voice clear, calm, and carrying in the close, still air of the alley. "Not alimony. Not a settlement. Not an obligation. Charity. Use it for a doctor, for food, for a bus ticket somewhere else. There will be no more. Not a cent. Not a word." I looked at them both, these people who were once the sun and moon of my constricted solar system. This is the last time our paths will cross in this life. You are part of a history I am choosing to leave behind, a lesson I have learned, a debt that is now paid in full. As my car, a silent, sleek sedan, pulled away from the crumbling curb, I allowed myself one final glance in the rearview mirror. They were two shrunken, gray, defeated figures in the dirty, narrow alley, already turned inward, arguing violently over the contents of the envelope, their bond reduced to mutual desperation and blame, just as I had once been a shrunken, blue, silent figure on a grand, lonely porch. But this time, as the car turned the corner and they disappeared from view, I felt no pull, no connection, no bitter triumph. Only the quiet, profound, soul-deep satisfaction of a heavy, rotten, oppressive door being firmly, permanently closed, locked, bolted, and the key melted down in the fires of my own reclaimed future. The storm of their making had finally, exhaustively, passed over them, leaving them perpetually drenched in the cold, relentless rain of their own consequences. For me, the clouds had parted, revealing a vast, sun-drenched, boundless sky of my own design, my own power, my own making, my own destiny. And it all traced back, through the labyrinth of pain and betrayal, to that single, crystalline, world-altering moment in the drowning dark, to the formidable, majestic grandmother who appeared not as a simple rescuer, but as an avenging angel of my own bloodline, and to the three, earth-shattering, foundation-cracking words that demolished a gilded prison of lies to lay the bedrock for a palace of unshakable truth: "Tear it apart,